7:29 in my watch.
By your watch, okay. How about now?
According to my iPhone, it's 7:29.
Ah, okay. Oh, well, now I just got a notice on my phone that it's 7:30, so I think we can start.
It is. It is. No, it is.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Good evening. This is the webinar for Life as a Human Rights Advocate, hosted by the School for Social Entrepreneurs. And this is a conversation with Raja Khouri. I will be telling you a little bit more about Raja in a moment, but first wanted to just welcome you cordially to the School for Social Entrepreneurs. I see at least one alum on the line. I don't know who all the other call-in folks are. So if this is your first time at SSE, welcome, welcome to the family. We are a big community of people who are interested in changing the world and doing so with the tools of business, doing things effectively, and making more than just cosmetic change. So I think this webinar tonight will be a really wonderful opportunity to hear how one tool in the Changemakers Toolbox can be used in your own life. And we'll hear a little bit more about how Raja Khouri has been doing advocacy in his. So let me just share a little bit of our screen, because I want to go over the call logistics. 1 second, let me see if I can move this out of the way. Are you able to see the people on the bottom? Let me see. Okay. All right. So if this is your first time with SSE, we'd love to see you come back for another webinar or workshop in the future. And you can find out about other workshops by going to our website, www.the-sse.ca or sseontario.org. Both of those work. And you'll see at the top of the menu bar, there are courses in the left-hand side, and then our newsletter at the right-hand side. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll be informed whenever we have big new courses coming about. And all of the workshops like this one are listed on our course page. In terms of call logistics, so for those of you who are on your computer, you're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, click on the Join Audio button at the bottom left of your screen and select Join by Phone, and the dial information will be displayed. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A by texting your questions in the chat box on the screen. You can also send in your questions anytime during the presentation, and we'll collect these and address them when we have our Q&A. If you're on the phone, your sound is on mute by default, but if you press *9 during the Q&A session, you'll be able to unmute yourself, and if you press *6, you will resume the mute. So again, *9 for unmute and *6 for mute. I also just want to apologize in advance. If you can't tell, I have a cold, a pretty bad cold. So I apologize if I cough or sneeze in your face, but luckily none of the germs are transmittable or transmissible over Zoom. So. And then lastly, I will say that we are recording this presentation, so you should feel free to just sit and relax and listen, and you can always listen again if you miss any part. Okay, good. And I didn't mention who I am. So my name is Marjorie Brands, and I'm the Managing Director of the School for Social Entrepreneurs. And I have a great pleasure of working at a school that welcomes many, many people from all walks of life who are in their communities, leading change from the grassroots up. And Raja Khouri is one of the people that I've had the great pleasure to meet in my time at SSE. He is one of our participants in our summer school program. He's a seasoned professional and recognized leader in social innovation, race relations, advocacy, human rights, and inclusion. He's currently a senior fellow with the Wellesley Institute and is co-founder and past president of the Canadian Arab Institute and a former commissioner with the Human Rights Commission. He's Canada Committee member of Human Rights Watch and is former advocacy chair, co-founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group. Raja has served on several governmental and civil society bodies, including Pride Toronto Community Advisory Panel, the Can you pronounce that for me, Raja? I will just say I am not Canadian, so there are sometimes some words that come up, and I don't know how to pronounce them.
You know, I remember the first time I saw this word, I said, "What?" The Couchiching.
Okay, thank you.
It's Couch for people who are sort of familiar with it. Yeah, it's called the Couch.
Okay, the Cooch. All right, well, we're learning something new. The Couchiching Institute on Public Affairs, and as president of the Canadian Arab Federation in the period following the events of 9/11, which I think were probably very fascinating. His professional background is in strategic leadership, organizational development, community engagement, and capacity building. So that's about Raja. And so Raja, we're going to open up the conversation to you again. And I'm just going to make sure that the call logistics are displayed in case anyone has any trouble during the call. Okay, well, so Raja, can you tell us what is advocacy?
Well, I'd like to see advocacy as a right of citizenship. It's the right of citizens to influence policy, to influence legislation, from things as simple as having a stop sign installed at the bottom of the street that you live in, that you live on, or at the other end of the spectrum, you can be advocating for a nuclear arms treaty, or the landmines treaty, and things that have actually already happened. So it's anywhere in between these two. Most of the time, advocacy is towards bodies of government or intergovernmental bodies, but you can also be advocating for a change of policy at a business, at a corporation. I've seen people, for instance, a few years back, Rogers had a habit of it's called negative billing. If you they will subscribe you to a service unless you call them and opt out of it. And people, advocated against that, and was removed. So, but most of the time, it is a group of people, a group of citizens. It could even be one citizen who is trying to, influence a change in policy, a change in law, or a bill, a law in the making, legislation in the making. Where there are hearings, where there are deputations, and room for citizen input into that legislation.
So, Raja, I hear a couple of things. First, what would you say is the common thread between the person who's advocating for a stop sign and the person who's advocating for changes in the landmine treaty? So, Jody Williams, she's quite famous for the work that she did. She was, just an average citizen, not she didn't have, she wasn't an elected official.
Right.
Won the Nobel Prize for doing something like that. So, what's the common thread between Jody and the person advocating for stop signs?
Well, I mean, you said one of the most important common threads is that these are regular people. These are not people who have been, given a certain qualification that allows them to advocate. These are regular people with a passion towards getting something done. If it's the stop sign at the end of the street, then it's a passion for safety for your neighborhood. And if it's a passion for ending landmines, then it's a passion for world peace and making the world a safer place for us, and particularly for children in war zones who end up being paying the price after the end of wars, with all these landmines being spread out all over war fields and war zones. And you might remember that after the landmines treaty, there was the treaty to ban cluster munitions. Cluster munitions are bombs that explode in the air, and they become small bomblets that they spread all over fields, and in effect those that don't explode become mines, and those that do explode, they explode without any precision, and they end up killing a lot of civilians. And the reason I mentioned this one in particular, it is how I became involved with Human Rights Watch back in, I believe it was 2007. Human Rights Watch was one of the sort of global partners, along with a number of other organizations who were trying to get the UN General Assembly to adopt a ban on cluster munitions. I was immediately attracted to that myself, because the year before that, in 2006, there was a war in South Lebanon between the Hezbollah militia and Israel. And near the end of that war, Israel blanketed large areas of the south of Lebanon with cluster bombs that made vast fields unusable for agriculture, and led to the maiming or killing of many children who would trip on these things. And being born in Lebanon, originally from Lebanon myself, that's where I was, immediately the issue spoke to me, and I developed this passion to making this happen, so that there will be the use of cluster munitions will become banned, and no more of this kind of civilian casualty, civilian suffering will happen in other places in the world the same way that it did in South Lebanon.
Well, so Raja, I mean, you talk about the passion you had for that issue, and I mean, it's really obvious why you would have passion for it. But tons of people could have passion for it. What changed? What triggered in you the decision to go from passion to active ownership of this issue? Because there's something different about someone who will actually go advocate.
That's a good question. Most people tend to complain about bad policies or bad laws or bad traffic signs, and what really moves one to do something is a feeling of empowerment and empowering. When you do something about an issue that you care about, it empowers you. And even if you don't succeed, you feel empowered in the sense that you are trying to do something about that issue, and not just sitting there feeling that you're helpless and that the world is a bad place, politicians are bad, City Hall is bad, bureaucracy is bad. It's not a good feeling, and you can either choose to live with that feeling, or you can choose to do something about these issues that mean something to you. And clearly, there are many issues out there. You're not going to be motivated to get involved in all of them. You're motivated to get involved in something that you really, care for and motivated by. And, I remember the early days of, getting involved in sort of citizen activism, the feeling of empowerment. Even if you don't get what you want, you feel that you're doing something, you're getting the word out there, you're getting your views out there, and people are hearing about them.
Yeah. Can you talk about the time it takes to get the change that you need to see? Because it may feel like for a long time you're just spitting into the wind. But you said it, you still feel good because you're not passive anymore. You're active. You're taking active ownership, but you're still not getting the results you want. So what do people have to be prepared for?
Look, it's things never happen quickly. And you know, making change happen is notoriously slow. And sometimes you get, you know, part of what you want. Once in a while, you know, you get all of what you want. Most often, you may not get anything at all. But the sense of empowerment, the sense of being active about something is, I think, is the first reward from getting involved. The amount of time it takes can, you know, can vary widely with, you know, with the size of the issue that you're trying to influence, but also with the amount of leverage that you have. You know, one of the things I learned is that, you know, building partnerships, building allies, reaching out to as many people as possible who might subscribe to your cause can make a huge difference. And I'll give you as an example, when I first became president of the Canadian Air Federation, shortly after 9/11, as you can imagine, and you mentioned, you know, that must have been, you know, a thrilling experience. It was a heck of an experience. You know, I basically jumping in the deep end of the pool. There were many things that I didn't know and had to learn very quickly. You know, what we were trying to do at the time is to limit the infringements on civil rights that was sort of the knee-jerk reaction after 9/11, was to put in place a series of laws and practices that were, in essence, a scaling back of the civil rights that we were used to as Canadians, and that tend to affect my community, Arabs, Muslims, in particular more than others, because of the, you know, the climate at the time. And one of the first things that I did when I became president is look for allies, and I found them in, you know, civil rights and human rights organizations, labor organizations, and as it happened at the time, a group based in Ottawa was forming a new collective, a new network. They call it the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. And they were concerned about the changes that were happening that affected civil rights as I was. So immediately, you know, becoming part of that network, you know, it empowered me and you know, gave me the sense that I'm part of a group. I'm not by myself out there whistling in the wind and with no one to listen to. And I have forgotten completely now what the question was. But the thing is that the point I wanted to make is, you know, if you have allies, if you have people working with you, then that, you know, increases your capacity to influence and make change happen, and that could, you know, that could make things happen, you know, happen faster.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, I mean, you know, beyond the sort of moral support that you get from working with other people, what kind of change becomes possible when you go from a single advocate to a group of advocates?
Well, I mean, the biggest change is resources. You know, the resources that you have when you have a collective working together is a huge difference from the resources that you have as one person or one organization with its limited, you know, with its limited resources. So when you have labor unions as part of that collective, they have money, they have resources, they can hire staff, they can help you hire staff. You know, in situations like that, when you're trying to, I mean, we were trying to influence the government from one side against the influence that the U.S. government was putting on, the pressure that the U.S. government was putting on the Canadian government from the other side. So you can see what we were up against, and so we needed to have as broad a coalition of forces working with us to try and you know, counter the weight of the U.S. government as much as possible. We knew we will not be able to win that war, but we were trying to influence it as much as possible to make it as least harmful as possible to the civil rights of Canadians.
And do you have any tips around strategy for putting a coalition together?
You know, it's easier to put a coalition together if you have established relationships. So if you know people and people know you, when you approach them and say, let us work together on this thing, it's going to happen much faster than strangers trying to come together who don't know each other, who don't know if they can trust each other, who don't know what the agendas might be, the motivations might be for people. So if you already know people in the field that is of interest to you and they know you, and there's trust and there's a sense of camaraderie already there, then it's easy to say, okay, folks, we need to work on this issue. It has just come up. And I'll give you an example. It happened just this past week. An organization, it's a sort of a corporate club of sorts, wanted to put together a panel on Islam, and for all I know, their motivations were positive. There was no maliciousness in the sense, but they wanted to put this panel to educate their members on Islam and its relationship to the West. But the way they went about it was they had people who didn't know much about the issue and approached it from their own negative biases, and it ended up with a panel of people, the majority of whom were going to not to educate, they were going to miseducate people about Islam and perpetuate the stereotypes. And they were going to talk about terrorism and extremism and national security, which is already there every day in the papers and on the news. It's not, you know, it's not how you educate people on Islam. Yes, that's part of the, you know, the current environment we live in, is that there is such a thing as Islamist extremism and there is terrorism, but that is not the story of Islam. Anyway, make long story short is that I've been in this field for many years, and I know a number of organizations and individuals who would feel the same way about this panel than I do, and all it took was to send a few emails around to people I know and who knew me, and we all know where we're coming from and what our motivations are. And we were quickly able to put together a collective response to that panel and address it together. Now, if this had been the first time, you know, it would have taken weeks for us to try and put something together. So you need to have that, build that network, build that in the field that interests you, so that you know people and people know you. And that sets the groundwork for people coming together to work on a particular issue.
Right. So you talk about having a clear sense of the other players' motivations, because that's really important in building trust in a coalition. Let's go back to your motivation. What is the first time you remember as a child standing up for something that you believed in, but maybe wasn't popular? I'm curious about the roots of your advocacy.
Most of the issues I've believed in and so far were unpopular. So, and I don't know. I guess I'm not someone who likes to talk about myself, but I've always had a sense of justice in me, and I never like to see people being, you know, mistreated, put down, treated differently. I knew that as a child, I always felt that I had a feeling of empathy, you know, for others. I remember once we were at the dinner table, and my family and my youngest sister, I don't know, she had done something wrong, and everybody sort of piled up on her, and everybody was criticizing her at the same time. And I remember standing up from the table and telling them, you know, I'm not going to take this. And I left the dining area and went to my room. And I remember my mother phoned me and she said, "What's going on?" And I explained to her. I said, "Like, what are you doing? Why is, you know, everybody's piling up on this, you know, on poor child?" And she said, "You know, you're right. I didn't realize we were doing that." But it's, you know, there's that sense of fairness, and I'm certainly not unique in that. There are many people who feel that sense of fairness and get, you know, seriously ticked off when it's not happening.
Yeah.
And you know, you'd feel that among advocates of, you know, human rights and the like, who you know, believe in you know, decent treatment of everyone, respect for everyone, and they reject any form of oppression and tyranny that, you know, comes mostly from imbalances of power, and so that's kind of how it goes.
So that's so interesting, because it ties back to your opening, Salva, when you're talking about advocacy being, you know, everything from advocating around the stop sign up to the landmine treaty, right? So, you know, people have this sense, and we see abuses of power all up and down the, you know, daily life, from everything from something very small to big. And sometimes it's not abuse of power, sometimes it's just simply neglect, but, you know, it is a reflection of an imbalance in power, because I can say that the most powerful people, you know, living on powerful powerful people living on streets usually have the stop signs they need, right? And I also noticed that, you know, every student that comes to SSE, and many of our mentors and our volunteers, they have very similar stories to yours. You know, it's these little things that there's this sense of justice that guides them through their lives, and it is that unwillingness to sit with an injustice when they see it. And I think that's what changes it from passion to active ownership of an idea. One of the participants, she asked a question. I wanted to share it. So how do you discover what you're truly passionate about enough to want to act? I feel like I have many interests and causes I could advocate for, but because of a lack of focus, I haven't really been able to act very much.
You know, it's like many things in life. All you have to do is do it once, and once you've done it once, you feel that that sense of empowerment that you get from that experience makes you want to do it again and again, and for other issues. If it's a matter of getting started, just pick one issue, you know, that you care about, and start getting involved in it. And it may end up being the issue for you, or it may be just the issue to get you started and get your feet wet and get your juices going. But you know, you know, that you read the newspaper or you watch the news, and certainly you can come up with a dozen issues every day that, you know, that tick you off, that you feel are not just. But certainly, you know, I mean, in choosing something, it not only needs to be something that you care about, that you have passion for, that, you know, makes you mad, or but it also helps when it's something that you feel, maybe I can do something about that. You know, I, for instance, you know, the president of the Philippines is a serious, you know, violator of human rights, and, you know, he's a mini Trump of sorts. That's not that, you know, does it bother me? Yes, it does. Does it bother me enough to want to do something about it? No. You know, it's not something that's, you know, the issue is not close enough to my heart to make me want to spend time and effort on it. So, you know, you do have to make choices in the end, what issues get you involved, because there's also burnout. there's definite burnout in advocacy because, like I said, many times you advocate and you don't get results. And yes, you feel good that you at least done something. But if that happens, 2, 3 times in a row, and you feel a sense of, I want to step back a little bit and just, I'm burnt out.
Yeah.
It's because you have passion for something. You're involved not only intellectually, you're involved emotionally, and when you don't achieve your results, it's a downer, but at the same time, you feel at least you've tried, and you don't have that feeling of helplessness. And you know what? When you do achieve what you worked on, it's a huge reward. Um, for instance, again, during my days at the Canadian Federation, there was, the Iraq War looming in 2003, and the United States were putting pressure on Canada to join in with them. And we all know in the end, the Prime Minister Chrétien at the time said, no, we're not going to do it. But that took a lot of work. Our organization was one of many that mobilized people, and there were demonstrations, and there were op-eds, and there were lobbying efforts with MPs and ministers, and in the end, despite the excessive pressure from the Americans for us to get involved, the Prime Minister felt that, you know what, Canadians don't want this, and he felt empowered to say to the Americans, thanks, but no thanks. Again, our part and my part was small in it, but I was there. I spoke at demonstrations. I spoke to the media. I remember a phrase that stayed on the CBC website for a quote, for a long time, and it was, we're not, and I think that if I remember correctly, it was, we should not be violating international law to appease the Americans. I said that on CBC, the National, and they put it on their website. It was on their website for weeks. Did that quote make a difference? I have no idea, but you feel that your voice was there, and it was part of the voices that was working against Canada's involvement in that war, and in the end, collectively, we won.
Yeah.
And the cluster bombs treaty went ahead. We won. There were legislations that we were able to impact to some extent to lessen the severity of a certain measure on civil rights, for instance. So the rewards are there. It does need patience, and again, most of all, it really that coalition building and partnerships are key.
Yeah, and you talked about the Philippines example, that the Philippines, the behavior of Duterte's isn't close enough to your daily experience to sort of feel close to that issue. And to me, that speaks a bit to the role of legitimacy and advocacy. So can you talk about, does an advocate need to be personally tied to an issue to work effectively on it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Not at all. If like being tied to an issue serves as a personal incentive, a personal motivation to get you involved. But all of people at Human Rights Watch, their job is advocacy 99% of the time, and they do it through research. The research was happening in a certain situation, expose it, make it known, and they shame the perpetrators, and they use that information to lobby governments to pressure the perpetrators of human rights violations in certain countries and so on and so forth. And if I'll be very happy working there, and I'll be happy to work on any issue, regardless of if the Filipino were meant anything to me or not, because human rights are human rights. They're universal. You get violated in one place, then they can get violated in another place. So, I really don't think that there has to be that connection. If you're someone who believes in the larger justice, say, social justice, international law, international humanitarian law, and then these are very broad umbrellas that allow you to get involved in an array of issues and topics.
Right. Okay, so I mean, you've talked a lot about sort of the international human rights law. I think many people on this call are probably familiar with the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and groups like that. Do you have any success stories or case examples of people who are doing advocacy that is sort of more Canadian, Toronto, maybe accessible to people on this call who aren't necessarily getting, an LLM in human rights law?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, people are engaging in issues, all the time. Like, look at the current issue of Me Too, sexual harassment, this issue, after decades of not being at the forefront, has now reached the point where there is consensus that this is wrong and it cannot go on anymore. And this is where timeliness in advocating for an issue is perfectly clear and perfectly important, in the sense that the issue is out there, people know about it, it already has the recognition of being wrong and not acceptable anymore, and we've seen a lot of women's rights organizations and so on, getting in now and wanting to take advantage of that public awareness, or public consensus, and push for an end to this kind of practice, and for policies and so on that doesn't allow this to sort of continue anymore. Think of environmental groups that are advocating on an ongoing basis for an end to certain practices by some corporations, especially the extraction industries, mining and so on, or for the carbon pricing that now after years and years and years of advocacy by environmental groups, that now this has become acceptable in the mainstream. And even if you look at some right-wing publications have come to accept that there's an issue here that needs to be addressed, and we should be paying the cost for that issue. So this is happening every day, and I'd like to make a distinction here between advocacy and lobbying, because lobbying is specifically working on members of parliament or ministers or the civil service in certain ministries to influence their decision-making process. And in Canada, official lobbyists have to be registered and known to be doing what they're doing, because you need to avoid issues of conflict of interest. Whereas advocacy is very, 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 very broad. You can be advocating through letter writing campaigns, through education, public awareness, campaigns. You can be advocating by walking down the street with a sign. You can be, publishing op-eds. You can be. There's a whole host of tools available to you to advocate for a cause, which is sort of different from the the specific the term lobbying that Canada that has. The term lobbying has in Canada.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about tools, and I'm going to just pause for one moment to remind people that if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat function. And we have about 20 minutes left. So in a few minutes, I'm going to pause the conversation to just invite anyone on the phone who wants to contribute a question. But while we wait for that, I wanted to ask about tools. You talked about the Me Too advocacy of women, and a lot of that's been happening over social media. So I'm wondering, what do you see are some of the new trends in advocacy that are, tech-enabled or offer opportunities for sort of business development? Because, this is the School for Social Entrepreneurs, and we are trying to use the tools of business to create the social and environmental change we want to see. So do you see any connection between advocacy and social enterprise?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the technology today allows you to do things that you couldn't have, dreamt of doing before. I remember back in the olden days when, we would have calling what they call them, I think calling trees or something, where I call you and you call two other people and then they call two other, so that we can get the word around for people that something is happening. Well, now of course you can send an email and that's done. We used to have to communicate with members of a certain organization by mail. So a few of us will get together one Sunday afternoon and they'll have all these letters photocopied, stuff them in envelopes, put the stamps on them. I mean, that of course has all changed. And then you've got, the social media is huge. You have a cause, you create a page for it on Facebook, and invite your friends, and they invite their friends, and within hours, you can have hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are engaged in that cause and are accessible to you to mobilize, communicate with, and have them do something. You have the online petitions now. I mean, we used to go around with these, boards and pieces of paper and collect signatures and it'll take you a month to collect 100 signatures, or now you can, through online petitions, you can do that, much faster and easily. So there's a lot more, efficiency and advocacy and mobilizing and organizing, thanks to social media. Now, in terms of, business and business skills, I benefited a lot. My first job in Toronto was with a bank. I was in human resources and training and those kind of things with one of the big banks, and I did that for 6 years until I, realized that finance and banking is not for me. But during those 6 years, I learned a lot of business skills, how to strategize, how to set goals, how to create objectives, and how to make plans. And when I started, when I entered, the world of activism, I realized that most people didn't have those skills because they came from different backgrounds, or they were attracted to the issue, but they didn't have the skills to organize and make strategies and make plans. And and actually, be focused in their approach on what their goals are and objectives and so on and so forth. So so going back to building alliances, that's another upside of building alliances, because you can bring in all sorts of skills into the group that you need to achieve your goals, and no one has all skills, so you benefit from those kinds of skills. And you see in many nonprofit organizations, when they create their boards, they create a skills matrix, and they say these are the kind of skills we need on this board, and they go out and find people who have those skills, but also have the passion for the cause of that particular organization. So you need both sides.
Right. This may be somewhat related. A question from the audience: what if you don't know anyone in the sector you're trying to influence? How do you start?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
What if you don't know anyone in the sector you're trying to influence? How do you start?
You volunteer. You look at people who are engaged in that sector and that issue, and you go there and you say, okay, how can I help? And that's how you start building your network. You go to conferences. Many of the organizations and causes these days, they do networking events, they do receptions, they do educational events. They say, come and let's hear about this, let's talk about it. So there's no shortage of ways to get involved, and most organizations welcome. Very happy to receive volunteers, and because they're always short-staffed and short on resources.
And so there's a very similar question to this one from the audience. So what's a good entry point for a student looking to start off a career as an advocate? So you just talked about volunteering. Do you have any suggestions about advocacy groups that you think are particularly effective in Canada or in Toronto, since probably most people on this call are from Toronto, that might take volunteers that they could look into?
Well, it's vast. I mean, you have one of the best resourced and funded groups are health advocacy groups. If you think the Heart and Stroke Foundation or the Cancer Society, or if that's that's an area that if health and is something that you feel something about, then these organizations are very well structured, very professional, and when you want to volunteer for them, they'll assess your skills, what you have to offer, and they'll slot you into an area that is in line with your skills, but also with your interests. They'll ask you what is it that you'd like to learn about, what is it the kind of experience that you'd like to be involved in. So it's huge. We have an amazing array of organizations in this country. The charitable sector is huge, humongous, and one thing I can caution against is that the smaller, less experienced organizations can be sometimes a challenge, in the sense that personalities tend to play a role more so in those kinds of places, and they may not have structures for taking in volunteers. They may not be able to fit you into an area of work that's in line with your interests, and you might end up with a disappointing experience unless you clarify from them from the beginning what your expectations are, what their expectations are, and how that is going to manifest itself. How many hours do they expect from you? What are you going to be spending doing these hours, and so on? Because you don't want to end up being disappointed and feeling that you're not being used well, or you're just being just taken advantage of or taken for granted.
Yeah. Well, Roger, you're giving us some really, really great advice. And I just think this might be a good time to remind people that this is the first part of a two-part workshop series with you. So you'll be doing a longer workshop in person, and we'll be sending out the details of that in the follow-up to this webinar, so everybody can register for that. But you'll be giving more practical tips and tricks and strategies for becoming an advocate in your workshop.
Right, and we will look at the whole array of tools that are available. We will look at case studies, and we will be asking people what is it that they're trying to accomplish, what are they that are important to them, and help them to the extent possible to come out of that workshop with a sense of what they want to do next.
Yeah. So maybe with the remaining time, I'd like to ask just a couple more questions. Can you talk about what in your career you regret? What you had done differently?
That's an easy one. But you know what? One thing I regret because I ended up paying the price for, and that is becoming too engaged in advocacy and working for causes without any financial compensation involved, and for a period in my life, I ended up accumulating a lot of debt. I wasn't making any income, or not much of an income, because I was dedicating most of my time towards the causes that I was involved in. So it was a case of overzealousness on my part. I was enjoying what I was doing so much that I neglected the realities of life and the need to make a living, and I, I ended up in a difficult situation financially that took a long time to get out of. Not too many people do this, but it's I was going through a stage in my life where I really wanted everything that I was doing to be of meaning, and I just didn't care about money. And was it worth it? It was a heck of an experience. I loved it. I learned a lot from it, but there was a price.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And I'd love to just hear a little bit more about how did you go from standing up for your sister at the dinner table to this very, very impressive list of credentials that I read at the beginning? What were the steps in between? How did you make a career as an advocate, go into debt, get out of that debt, and then, are you a full-time advocate now, or what do you see yourself as?
I did not know. I mean, I did not realize that sense of justice that I had. I mean, I didn't know about it until, and I remember my wife's friend back then. We were talking about women's issues and feminism, and she looked at me and she said, so like, you're an Arab, you come from a society that is known to be sort of male dominated, and so how come you're an advocate for women's rights and a feminist and so on? And I that took me back. I hadn't thought of it in that sense, and that's when I realized it was a sense of of justice. It's not right to treat people like inferior people, treat women and treat like they are second-class citizens or with lesser rights. And when it was obvious to me that that men and women were equal in so many ways, although being different. So and then at the end of 6 years at the bank, I mentioned I was working at the bank. I left the bank really not knowing what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to do banking anymore. I didn't want to do finance. I knew that I was sort of leaning away from sort of commercial values, and I knew that I didn't care to become rich. It wasn't the most important thing for me. I was 35 at the time, and so one of those like the midlife crisis things, and what am I about? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? And that's when I started, volunteering with different types of organizations, trying to find something that spoke to me. I remember volunteering with Meals on Wheels and Big Brother and a number of things. And then one of them was the Canadian Arab Federation, which was primarily an advocacy, organization for the rights of Canadian Arabs and giving them a voice and so on. And that was a big deal because there wasn't a voice at all back then. I mean, the community couldn't get anyone's attention. And that's where I found my passion in that sense of advocating for the unfairness of the marginalization of the Arab community in Canada. And that's where I found that this is something that, a challenge that really moved me. It really made me want to wake up in the morning and do something. And it's from there, I got into civil rights. From civil rights, I got into human rights. Joined the Canada Committee of Human Rights Watch. And then I was appointed to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I served there for 10 years. It's a part-time, commitment, and everything kind of, things followed each other in that direction. And then in 2012, I co-founded the Canadian Arab Institute, which was meant to be a much more sophisticated version of the of a community organization that is able to work from the inside of the system, that is able to mainstream the issues and work as part of Canadian society, which was different from the Canadian Arab Federation back in '97 that I joined in '97, who were on the outside, sort of whistling in the wind and doing whatever they can, but really not knowing what they're doing, trying to get someone to listen to them. And then, so 5 years later, I left. Now I'm doing research work with the Wellesley Institute. Part of me is always an advocate. Even the research work I'm doing at the Institute is towards how do we strengthen Canadian multiculturalism? How do we make it less susceptible to the forces of nativism and populism that we're seeing in the United States and part of Europe and so on and so forth?
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. So with the 2 minutes we have of remaining time, do you have any last words of advice or wisdom for the people on the call who may be considering a career as advocates?
I'd like to recap, I guess, a couple of things I already said before. Choose the right team. It's very important to choose the right team. Otherwise, you can end up being, frustrated and demotivated. Make sure that people that you're working with in a certain cause are people that share your values, but also share your motivations. There's always room for personal agendas to play, to kick in, and that's human nature. But there's personal agendas, and then there are other personal agendas, and they need to be within the context of a group that knows how to handle these competing agendas and to work effectively. So choose the right team. build your networks, build your allies, build your partnerships. Start with one person and it grows from there. That's how networking works. And the last thing I'd like to say is learn from people who have done this before you. I've seen so many groups start up wanting to work on a certain issue, and they act as if they are the first ones to work on it. They don't care to learn from people who have worked on it before, from the mistakes of others. They think they have all the answers, so they go in there and they start doing stuff, and they're spinning their wheels and missing a lot of opportunity because they haven't tried to learn from others who have been doing this before. And some people come to me and they ask for advice, and I'm always open to that. And I share my learnings with people because it will make them more effective. It will help them avoid mistakes that I've made and others I know have made.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Raji, you've been very generous with your time, your advice, your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. We look forward to the in-person workshop where it'll be practical and hands-on, but having this background, knowing how you got where you are, gives us a lot of appreciation for what this kind of lifestyle is like, and we really hope that many of our SSE community will follow in your steps. So thank you, everyone.
My pleasure. I enjoyed this, and I'm really looking forward to the workshop. It should be interesting and exciting.
Sounds wonderful. All right, everyone, have a good evening and take care. And please don't get the cold that I've been suffering through this call. All right, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.